Let's go with that. Went down.
Yeah, we don't need it now.
Yeah, I just,
All right.
I didn't reset it.
We are on air, and this is the first work, and we start with Dan Harris, our Emergency Management Coordinator, talking to us about the Natural Hazard Mitigation Plan.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Mayor Beatty, Council, for having me here. My name is Dan Harris, and I am here to talk about the NHMP. So the natural hazard, this thing has betrayed me.
Sorry.
No, it's okay. Here, let's try to go to page 2. Will it not just go directly to it? Oh my. Okay, let's.
Oh, it's like, it's a fake out situation.
Yeah.
Let's, okay.
See, it'll change here, but it won't change there. So I'm happy to just like full screen it over there and rock and roll with that.
Hold on one second.
Okay.
I don't know what. Will you hit stop share on the Zoom screen over there?
Sure.
Thank you. And it's still acting like it's there.
Yeah.
Can you check and see if there's more than one open, maybe?
Yeah, you bet. Yeah,
Well,
there are several open.
why? Oh.
And it looks like maybe this one? Hey, look at that.
Okay.
All right.
Can we go back to share screen? I'm so sorry.
Yes. How do we do that?
That one. And then if you hover at the bottom of the screen over there.
Bottom of this screen.
Yes.
Okay.
And then we hit the green share. And then.
I bet
that
it's this one.
Yep.
Right?
Yeah.
That would seem likely.
Fantastic.
Hey, and is this in an okay place, Nicole?
We can move that.
Whatever's clever. I
You
just.
can hit the, see the little,
This guy?
this one, yep, that one. There we
Okay.
go.
Great. Well, hi, everyone. Thank you so much. We're here to talk about the Natural Hazard Mitigation Plan. So the Natural Hazard Mitigation Plan, as its name suggests, talks strictly about natural hazards. And I want to begin framing the conversation that way, just by saying that, people, sometimes when we talk about natural hazards, will say, like, well, what about some kind of a train derailment or I don't know, a situation of civil unrest? And my answer to that is that this plan deals with a train derailment if an earthquake causes it, but does not otherwise address that. So just strictly looking at natural hazards. This is a document that describes 10 natural hazards, and these are laid out by FEMA and by the Oregon Office of Emergency Management. We had some discussions early on if we should look at, for example, non-riverine flooding, so what's called pluvial flooding, which would be like stormwater systems backing up, that kind of thing. But we're required to stick with these 10 hazards that are laid out here. So to work within that requirement, we have talked about pluvial flooding within the plan. We've also talked about air quality within the plan. The thinking there being that air quality, while it is not one of our 10 natural hazards, is in this area most often associated with wildfire, which is one of those 10. And we'll get a listing of those 10 as we go through, but I just want to be clear as we're talking about this that there are some limitations that are placed on what Milwaukie can and cannot change within the plan. It's updated every 5 years with Clackamas County, and the Milwaukie Natural Hazard Mitigation Plan is actually an appendix of the county's plan. So part of what's driving our timeline on this is that the county has its own production timeline and then also its own submission timeline for the State Office of Emergency Management and then ultimately for FEMA. So we talk more about this at the end, but there are, in addition to the current round of community engagement and discussion with council, there will be 2 rounds of, there'll be a round of county, then state, then federal review before this actually comes back early next year for adoption. The purpose of this exercise is mostly to allow Milwaukie to reflect on its vulnerabilities, to allow the city to say, what are possible threats to the life and property within our jurisdiction, and what can we do to mitigate those things. It's also an essential part of both pre- and post-disaster FEMA grants, having a current and certified natural hazard mitigation plan. So this is due to be updated every 5 years. It was last adopted by an earlier iteration of this council in January or February of 2020. You'll notice that was not 5 years ago, but 5 years ago in 2024 would have been the 2019 update cycle. So the idea is that when this comes back for adoption in 2024, in early 2024, it will have been that 5-year cycle completed once again. Okay, so we may need to just click to move this, and that's okay too. Okay, so the mission and goals are set by the county. The city staff had an opportunity to provide input on these, but this was a group exercise. They're listed here. I do want to go ahead and just read out the mission: to enhance county resiliency and capacity to address natural hazards by promoting sound public policy and effective mitigation strategies designed to equitably reduce risks and impacts on community members, community lifelines, historic and cultural resources, property, and ecological systems. And the goals are listed there as well. As I said, it's broadly to look at what natural hazards pose risks to Milwaukie and to what degree they do. When we talk about risk, it's important to look at the intersection between the hazards and then vulnerable systems, which is to say, if there is nothing to threaten, you don't have risk. If there is nothing presenting that threat, you don't have risk. It's that intersection of these two things. So when we look at this, and we can see that broken down in the hazard vulnerability analysis matrix, you can see that we consider history of occurrences, vulnerability of our specific city, the maximum threat posed by each of these hazards, and then the probability. And this is a formula that was that is mandated by FEMA, and these are weighted differently. So, for example, I believe that history is weighted less heavily than maximum threat. So, as we go through this, we look at how often, for history, for example, in the last 100 years, have these disasters affected, or have these hazards actually threatened or caused damage within our community. Now, that's a little bit funky when you get to earthquakes, for example, or volcanoes, because we know that the Cascadia event is coming at some point in the future, and that there is some significant likelihood that that's going to occur. But if we look at the history of it for the past 100 years, then you would find out that, in fact, there's no danger of that according to this metric. So that's why it's scored so low there. Things that we did do that were a little bit different from what the county did is that we looked at maximum threat, and the standard that's applied to that is worst, not probable, but possible scenario. And so if you ask me about the worst possible scenario with an extreme heat event, then I'm going to tell you, well, that could get pretty bad. I mean, we could see real infrastructure degradation behind that. Also, we're factoring in things like air quality into the wildfire index, looking at, like I said, different types of flooding, and then also knock-on and combined effects of different hazards. So when we look at landslide and debris flow, for example, that was part of the discussion around earthquake hazards. That was part of the discussion around flooding hazards, because so many of the landslide and debris threats that we have in Milwaukie actually come from damage upstream, and that could be damage to dams, that could be debris floating downstream to us, damaging critical infrastructure in Milwaukie. So what I mean is that while this is the same matrix that was applied to all of the natural hazard mitigation plans in the country, and certainly by Clackamas County, we did provide some very localized consideration to these. One other thing that I would point out on this table is that although the top three here, extreme heat, wildfire, and flood, are noted as being top hazards. Oh, here, I'll put it over on the screen. Top hazards. If you look, the total threat score between, for example, riverine flooding and a Cascadia earthquake is 3 points. So I don't want to give the impression that because something is in the top tier, that's that wow, well, at the exclusion of everything else, we're going to focus just on this. What that does mean, though, is that when we look at it, the thing that is right now, according to our Hazard Mitigation Advisory Committee, which is an internal group composed of representatives from emergency management, the police department, public works, community development. Our feeling is that these are, in order, the most significant natural hazards to our community. Another part of this plan is a look at action items. So these are things that city staff intend to do over the course of the 5-year life cycle of this program, or of this plan rather. Some of these are what are called multi-hazard action items, and these are things that, when they're done, are going to have benefits for several different hazards. So when we look at multi-hazard action item number 1, coordinate with Clackamas County, the Office of Emergency Management, the American Red Cross, and other relevant agencies to identify shelter facilities within Milwaukie. Those are shelter facilities that could potentially be used in the event of an extreme heat event, could be used in the event of a winter storm, like a particularly bad winter storm. These are also the kinds of shelter facilities that we would be looking at following an earthquake or severe flooding of the kind that would displace lots of people is unlikely because of the way that Milwaukee is shaped, but not impossible. So anyway, that's all to say that these 5 listed here are the multi-hazard action items. Shelter, education, around, when I say education, I mean increase outreach and education for hazard awareness, and natural disaster preparedness, especially for vulnerable populations. Maintain and enhance strategies for debris management. There again, if you're talking about a winter storm or a windstorm, or if you're talking about an earthquake, debris is a concern, is a primary concern. Improve and obtain resources and equipment essential for responding. So basically make sure that we have the things that we need in place before there's a disaster so that we can get the city up and running as quickly as possible afterward. And then, of course, all of this, when we talk about natural hazards, almost everyone on that list, barring the geological ones, earthquakes and volcano, you can tie a direct line from climate change back to those disasters. I mean, it's no secret the summers are getting hotter, the weather patterns are getting more and more unstable. So we are aware of that, and probably the most important thing that we can be doing in terms of disaster preparedness in any community is making sure that people are ready within their own homes and within their own very localized communities to respond and to sustain after a disaster, while waiting for state and federal and regional assistance to arrive. But I would say right behind that, maybe the number 1 mitigation activity that we can be engaged in is doing what we can to address climate change, and that's something that the city has taken very seriously, and it's something that's written into this plan as well. There are other action items. So one specifically related to flooding, severe weather, which is sort of an amalgamation of extreme heat and winter weather, and then wildfire, which again, all of these are broken down in the plan in more specific detail. But something that I will say is that wildfire directly poses a relatively low risk to the city of Milwaukie. It's not impossible. I mean, we saw a fire at Elk Rock Island a few years ago. The various natural areas around the city are susceptible to burning, but it's just that it's unlikely compared to, for example, more rural parts of the county where they're seeing, real wildland fires burning over tens, hundreds of acres. But we still rated wildfire high, again, because of that air quality threat. And with that, we're going to continue to coordinate wildfire mitigation through Clackamas County and continue to work with our county partners, especially given that, of course, firefighting services are contracted through Clackamas Fire District 1. So from here, We are currently engaged in a round of community feedback. I have a list of community groups that I am drafting an email to today that's going to be sent out to them to encourage them to provide comment on this. This has already been through a Public Safety Advisory Committee review. This has already been to CERT, and we're continuing to receive feedback from both of those groups. But when I say community groups, I'm looking at Northwest Housing Alternatives, I'm looking at Water and Environmental Services, I'm looking at Willamette River Keepers, at North Clackamas Watersheds Council, that sort of thing. Groups that are not directly affiliated with the city in the way that PSAC is. And well, I guess CERT would be more in that second category, but I digress. Anyway, right now we're in a community feedback cycle. When we think about like IAP, rather IAP2, when we look at whether we're informing or engaging or empowering, this is largely informing at this point, but we are seeking meaningful feedback. I mean, I've received quite a bit of community commentary on the plan already, questions, suggestions, and the commitment that I've made is that we will not necessarily incorporate every piece of feedback, but everyone will get a response. Everybody will get a meaningful follow-up on what did we do with the communication that you sent in. Moving forward, we look into September when this plan will be submitted to the county for their review, and then October through January, the county, the Office of Emergency Management, and FEMA will be taking a look at this, reviewing it. My understanding is generally these are not heavily edited by those groups, because by the time that it's gone through all of the local reviews, by the time it's gone through county review, we've got a pretty good idea of what OEM and FEMA are looking for. But when they return it back to us early next year, I will bring it back to this council for a targeted adoption in February. At this time, I'll stop talking for a minute and say if there are questions or comments from council, I would love to hear them. Okay.
Well, I thought it was a really great document. I enjoyed reading it, actually. I learned a lot. But we'll start with questions. We have a order, so we'll start with Councilor Stavengard.
Thank you, Dan. This is really great. I just have two questions. One has to do with the information sharing that you just mentioned with specific groups, and I'm wondering what the information dissemination looks like for more vulnerable communities. I'm thinking about our houseless neighbors, households where English is not the primary language, and what sort of either groups are you reaching out to, or like engagement efforts have been made to make sure that information will go out rapidly to those folks.
Sure. I would say that at this point, the drafting portion of the plan, I am interested in ways to contact those groups more effectively. I think the more important push on that is going to be in terms of implementation and disaster preparedness. And so it's not that I'm not taking that section of this seriously, and if there are suggestions or ideas, I am very open to those. But right now where we're at is that this is being sent out with the intention that it will be more widely disseminated. I don't know that there's a specific this group, that group,
okay,
the other plan in place for this.
Okay, thank you. And then my second question has to do with the FEMA process. So you mentioned that the natural disasters that are in the plan are identified by, like it aligns with what FEMA has. So should we have a disaster, is there a reimbursement process that's already set up so that the city could apply directly for FEMA reimbursement, or do we have to work through the county for that?
My understanding is that that's dealt with on a case-by-case basis. So I know, for example, that following disasters on the East Coast, some of the hurricanes, you saw individual jurisdictions, like individual cities applying, but there were other situations where it made more sense for it to be a county-wide application. So my understanding is that we will be, if there is something that is specifically localized to Milwaukie, say there was a crustal earthquake, that would affect more than just Milwaukie, but theoretically we get a crustal earthquake that's hyper-localized, or like a particularly bad winter storm here, then we would have the opportunity to apply as a standalone jurisdiction. But if there was something like a countywide wildfire, for example, that then did affect Milwaukie, that would flow into the county process.
Okay, got it.
Yeah.
And then I guess I do have a third question.
Please.
I think Metro does designation of debris sites so that like if there's a Cascadia event, then debris goes to a certain location as the recovery process moves forward. I'm not sure if there's one in Clackamas County. Do you know?
I don't know for sure, but I can find that out and get you an answer on it.
Okay.
I don't know off the top of my head. What I would say is that we participate in Metro's debris management plan, Milwaukie specifically does, and then separately from that, the county just this last week has announced that they're in the process of getting a contract in place for debris hauling.
Okay.
And so what I'm not sure about, and this is a conversation that I really need to have with our public works team, is what the intersection is between those two plans. So, for example, we're participating with Metro, but if the county has resources available, what can we be doing and what do we need to do in an emergency to tap into those? And really, I think in that situation, it's largely going to come down to what's available and who can get here first.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Thank you,
Just so
Mayor.
you know, Counselor, it's interesting. I had not heard that Metro plays a role in that. When we had the major windstorms, nobody was there to be found. Cities individually were doing collection sites in their public works yards. I think in Westland in particular, it was the size of a football field and 6 feet deep. So absolutely something we will do some research on, because I think that is highly likely to be needed, and I really appreciate you bringing it up. The other piece I just wanted to make sure that all the council is aware of, we have received payments directly from FEMA, and we have coordinated through the county depending on the size of the grant. So usually it's about $80,000 to $100,000, or it's just not worth the extra audit and steps in order to do that. But when, say, the Kellogg Bridge went out, those funds came directly to the city. So we've done the full audits historically when we've needed to, because we've received FEMA dollars, but we try and avoid it if we can.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, you're finished?
Yes, thank you.
All right. Counselor Khosrowshahi?
Yes, I actually just was curious with the winter storms, considering that they were in the middle, but the last few winter storms we've had have been pretty dramatic, and there's been quite a few deaths from it because of loss of power and also driving conditions, road conditions, things like that. I'm just curious how it was rated. It wasn't in the top tier as a hazard.
So when we look at winter storms, I think part of the thing that's really dragging that down that jumps out to me immediately is vulnerability. So in Milwaukie specifically, what we've seen is that main roads have been kept open. That not that there have been no accidents or no risks, but just historically, what we've seen is the Public Works Department has been able to respond pretty effectively to the to the kinds of winter storms that we've seen. I don't think that, to my earlier point, I mean, if you look at the scoring difference between winter storm and flood, for example, that's 8 points on this metric. So really, I mean, everything here down through number 8, windstorm, I think poses some significant threat to the safety of the city, which isn't to say that it's an unsafe place to be. I just mean that if we're looking at these as real possibilities, everything down through windstorm is direct and historically observable recently. By the time you get down to landslide, debris flow, volcano, those are those are just less serious. But
Right.
but although winter storm is ranked in the middle there, in the middle only puts it behind earthquakes, floods, fires, and us cooking. So I really want to make sure to come away from this with the understanding that this is not, oh, well, that's number 6. So who even
Right.
cares about winter storms? That's number 6. We should be watching out for that one. So,
I appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, one comment, and I've got a couple of questions. I would like to add to the discussion about the Cascadia event because, you know, when everyone talks about the Cascadia event, that's the horror movie, you know. And the thing that I would add is that if you look at the state, I call it the state shake map. You know, it shows that the damage and destruction is directly, you know, related to the distance of the offshore fault. So when you look at the coast, you see, you know, an Irwin Allen movie, you know, structurals, you know, structures failing, tsunamis, and that kind of thing. And as you come inward, then the destruction starts to mitigate somewhat. And so if you look at where we are in the Portland and Milwaukie area, I think the state map actually says something like, you know, furniture will walk across the floor. Pictures will fall off the walls. But, you know, that event can be so big, it would have a lot of Cascadian events, no pun intended, you know, from transportation and utility disruptions. So I just wanted to put that in context. I think it's there, but I mean, that shake map is very telling. I would urge everyone to take a look at it.
Well, and one of the things that this report, this draft highlighted is that the risk is actually much more significant from a Portland Hills Hills fault
Yeah,
event
Yeah,
than
yeah.
from the Cascadia. That was totally news to me.
yeah, yeah.
well, and there too, Mayor Beatty, it's sort of a question of intensity. So there is a greater risk of a crustal fault type quake, and of course that's going to be closer, and so that's going to be and also closer to the surface in terms of like just where, you know, in the earth that's occurring. So there is more risk in that sense, and because it is so localized, you don't have those follow-on effects that Councilor Massey was alluding to, where, you know, we've got rather than, okay, well, you know, the Portland metro area needs assistance, the west coast of North America needs assistance, and so it is here locally a greater threat, and in the event of a you know, full-on Cascadia subduction zone quake, the biggest problem probably isn't going to be direct damage to this area. It's going to be disruption to transportation corridors, it's going to be disruption to utilities, and it's going to be getting help in and getting attention to, hey, we here in Milwaukie, the one in Oregon, we need help.
So, Dan, I just wanted to also say, very well done. I had no idea this plan existed, quite frankly. And so I thought it was very comprehensive, and I appreciate the rigor of the analysis. I do have a couple of questions. I think this comes in, I was trying to remember the term we use for this. Is we put a pin in it for later? What do we call it?
The bike rack.
The bike rack, yeah. So I think these might be bike racks that maybe the city manager may want to think about. So one of the discussions we actually had in our weekly meeting was, you know, drills or tabletop exercises or whatever. And I just want to make sure that we have something, and you mentioned this operations group. I can't remember the exact name of it. And I just want there to be a linkage between these two things, you know?
We talked about the continuity of operation plan.
Yeah. Continuity of operations, I should know that. And another bike rack one is where does a pandemic fit?
We're still trying to figure that out. I'm just kidding.
Well, that's a good bike rack then.
Well, and I don't know if this council saw it, but I think it was right when you started, we had completed our after action report for the pandemic. And I think it's worth reading, especially after looking through this document for Dan and just thinking about how we actually used these tools during that time.
Sure.
So we'll resend that out too. Thank you.
Okay.
Well, and that gets to kind of relates to one of my questions, which was, this, as I understand this report, the reason it doesn't include pandemic is because it's dictated by some code of federal regulation stuff that probably hasn't been revisited since the pandemic, and maybe it would.
Well, and this is natural hazards.
Yeah.
So that's a real hazard. It's just a health-related hazard, and so it'll come up in other spaces as well,
Yeah.
I believe.
I-
Giving him a chance to correct me.
I think that there's an argument to be made that it is indeed a natural hazard. What I would say is that there are other, there are other natural hazards that we know, or other plague-type natural hazards that we know exist, particularly in agriculture, and those have never yet made this list. So I would venture to guess that when we do get back into the emergency operations plan, we're going to be seeing a lot more discussion about that. This one here, I didn't have a good way to fit it in.
I promise not to forget.
Yeah, I suspect you won't forget that. I was interested, I had a handful of questions, and one of the things was about shelter facilities. So when I was a neighborhood chair, 10 or 12 years ago, one of my neighbors was very actively working with CERT and, working with the Red Cross to establish shelter sites. And I gather we do have some designated shelter sites?
Well, we did. We did at one time, and that's for me in my role as the emergency management coordinator. Events and emergency management coordinator. I think that in terms of administrative work, making sure that we have those figured out and that we know who's going to be staffing those and how those are going to be stood up, and in the event of emergency, are we looking at the Red Cross? Are we looking at FEMA? Who's on the other end of that phone? That's part of why I pushed that into that first category, that first multi-hazard action item. So there are places in Milwaukie that if we needed to right now establish a shelter, we would figure that out. But what I would like to do is I'd like to move us to a place where I can tell you the next time that we have this conversation, well, that's 2 weeks from now, but the next time after that we have this conversation, yeah, absolutely, Mayor, and this is a list of those places, and this is what we think that will look like.
Okay.
So.
Well, I hope there's, it sounded like we had some agreements before, so hopefully some of those can be resurrected. I remember one place they were talking about in an earthquake scenario, sort of assuming there was one that was going to be behind the Oddfellows. It was going to be like a large tent kind of, outdoor thing behind the Oddfellows. So anyway, and schools, you highlight them in the document, the typical ones, schools and other things. And I guess one thing I would, hope as we do talk to those groups is that even though this document is about natural hazards, some of those same needs will apply if we have the train derailment or if we have the, industrial accident and air quality or whatever it is. So, yeah.
I feel comfortable committing to I feel comfortable saying that if I'm having a shelter conversation with an organization, that I will not draw anything in that says yes to a wildfire, but no if somebody starts the fire.
Yeah.
So
Good, great. And I liked, I liked the outreach piece of this. And I just wanted to mention something I mentioned several times over the years when I was the liaison going to the Regional Water Providers Consortium, which is now Councilor Massey, that they have a lot of materials on emergency preparedness already translated. So, I mean, obviously their focus is on water and the, gallon a day per person thing and the, 14 gallons or whatever it is. I do have 14 gallons, by the way. But I do think we don't have to reinvent the wheel, I guess, is my point. I think there are a lot of things between that group and other groups that are probably available.
Absolutely. And if I may say, we do have quite a bit of that material already. The county and OEM both have been very generous and forthcoming with that. It's just a question more of making sure that we've got it accessible, that we've got it ready to be deployed, that we've got it ready to be used,
Right.
rather than
Right.
sitting in a drive
Yeah.
somewhere.
Somewhere, right. And one other thing, and this is really just a comment, I guess it is a question that table MA3 shows the Milwaukee's probability and vulnerability next to Clackamas County's probability and vulnerability. And it came as a surprise to me that we assess wildfire higher than they do. They considered wildfire medium vulnerability, whereas a lot of people, as you pointed out, a lot of people in the more rural areas have a higher vulnerability. So have they not reassessed, or is this their old rankings, or is this their current rankings?
Mayor, these are their current rankings. My understanding is that they're missing the smoke for the flames.
Yeah.
And I mean, as we sit here on the 1st of Smaugus, we've been really lucky this year to not get, those kinds of, sun darkening, smoky skies that we've seen in past years. But I mean, I remember sitting in this building and being told, it was actually my first day working in this building. I got a call from my supervisor and she said, "Hey, where are you at?" And I said, I'm at my desk. And she said, "You shouldn't be at your desk right now. Go home. This building isn't, there's smoke in the building. Get out of the building."
Yeah.
So the difference on that one specifically is the smoke, is that we are just factoring it in, because there's nowhere in here, because as you said, this is drawn from federal regulations that probably haven't been revisited, and there is just nothing in here that talks about what happens when you can't breathe the air.
Yeah.
So we are shoehorning it into the wildfire discussion because it's just too important to leave out, and there's nowhere else that it quite fits. So.
Okay, fair enough. The repetitive loss stuff with the flooding, I noticed it said we have 11 properties and 7 of those are uninsured. So for counselors who weren't around then, after the 2015 flood, there was one of these properties that, FEMA offered funding to buy several properties that routinely flooded. And, but if you have flood insurance, they will pay you 100% of whatever the real market value of your home. If you don't have flood insurance, they will only pay you 75%. And people did not want to take that, chose not to take the 75%. So I guess, is there anything we can or should be doing to try and encourage people to have the insurance?
To have the insurance, yes. We do have conversations with families who come in and talk to us about it. We have had individuals who have been interested later, at taking us up on the 75%.
Have they?
But unfortunately, it is a substantial amount of workload for a very small number of families, and we're in the middle of construction season. So this would be engineering who would be taking on those projects. We've talked to the county about running the process for us because they get more of these requests, and so they're more used to them, and it goes faster. It's still a year-long process. So we would need families to engage for the full year and to stay committed during that process. And even with that, it can be quite arduous. So I'm also just putting out there that, yes, you want flood insurance. It helps with that part of it. and we do these in chunks because it takes a huge lift, and at certain points we just can't.
Right. Well, and I guess I thought the funding was also time limited. I didn't realize it would still be available. I mean, at the time after the 2015 flood, I mean, it was couched as if it was a finite time that people could opt in.
There are still programs
There
that
are.
you can use.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay. Well, yeah, however, anything we can do, anybody out there, please get the flood insurance. You will. Undergrounding. I
Yes.
mean, I love the idea of more undergrounded. I always bring it up when we talk about downtown and redevelopment commission money, but it's an expensive proposition. Is there, and frankly, downtown might not be the most important place to underground. Is there anything that's identified like priority areas for undergrounding?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay.
Mayor. What I would say is that, and this is a conversation that I was having with engineering not too long ago. Essentially, the idea here is not that it would be great if we never had to worry about another power line blowing down. And in reality, what we're looking at is more as there are these larger projects, as there are new subdivisions, as there are redevelopments, as there's, and particularly around critical infrastructure, hospitals. Public safety is run on a generator if it needs to be, but around those types of buildings, and particularly too, once we start identifying where these actual shelter sites are, it's not a question of can we get everything underground. It's a question of can we focus on opportunities? Can we focus on these as prioritized sites? And that of course is also going to be in conjunction with utility providers.
Right.
They get mad. I found out if you just start throwing dirt on their power lines, you got to talk to them first.
Yeah. Okay. And then just one, I guess, sort of philosophical question. In talking about flooding, and the Willamette in particular, I just wondered if we need to make note of the fact that the Willamette is tidal. I don't know how that really plays into flooding, but I feel like it might. And so I think a lot of people forget that the Willamette is tidal, and you have to, watch the tide. Anyway, okay. Any other questions or comments for Dan? Anybody? Okay, well, great.
Thank you very much, Mayor Beatty. I'll be back in 2 weeks. So if you do think of anything in the meantime, if you do have additional questions, if you hear from constituents, well, what about this? I will be right back here in this seat 14 days from now. Same emergency management time, same events channel. And if I could just say in parting, Mayor, I appreciated your email this morning or whenever it was sent. Ann shared it with me. Good catch, just throughout. I'm just going to say good catch.
Yeah.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Sure. All right. Well, thank you, and we'll see you in 2 weeks. And people out there, this is up on Engage Milwaukie, engage.milwaukee.com. Oh, it's there. Oh,
It's not, but engage.milwaukeeoregon.gov.
Gov.
Or it's also on a banner on the homepage at milwaukeeoregon.gov, and there will be, it's in the pilot, and there will be a social media post going out later this week, and then another one later in the month. So
yeah.
get out there, please. We would love to hear from you.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. And our other item on our work session agenda is our annual meeting with the Planning Commission. And I see we have a planning manager, Laura Weigel, Jacob Sherman, who's currently the chair, is that correct? Correct, okay, and Aaron Carpenter, are you the vice chair? No, oh no, one of the planning commissioners, okay. Oh, okay, great.
We have Commissioner Edge, we have Commissioner Vice Chair Freeman, and Commissioner Will Mulhern, who's our most recent. He is just and he had his first meeting last week, so he's all new. So Commissioner Carpenter is also fairly new to the commission. Now the old hat.
Well, welcome. We're glad to have you here, both in the room and online.
Sorry.
Ah, there we go. Now we can see them.
We do this every year. We have a joint meeting with the Planning Commission and the City Council just to kind of talk about what the Planning Commission has been working on for the past year, what's kind of in the immediate future, and then what might be on the next couple of years. So we'll kind of just go through that and let everybody kind of discuss, and I'll try to answer any questions and everybody ask questions and just discuss kind of the work that we've been doing and what's coming up. All right. Applications. We looked at code revisions and development review. We started out with a bundle of state required code revisions. These are things that some of them we knew were coming, some of them we didn't know were coming, and there's probably more of those to come in the future, so that actually took up quite a bit of time in 2022. We looked at middle housing, we looked at the middle housing land division, the climate-friendly equitable communities work, and then the electric vehicle charging station infrastructure, all of which also came to you as well, so you're pretty familiar with that. And then we also, in 2022, we talked about the housing capacity analysis with the Planning Commission, and then actually in 2023, we talked about the housing reduction strategy with the Planning Commission. Then we also had a couple of staff-initiated code revision packages. We had the downtown design review standards process, and we also looked at our high-density residential zoning amendments, which we were planning on doing as part of the comp plan phase 1, but it turned out to be a little complicated, and we ended up at the end of the day going from 1 high-density residential, 5 high-density residential zones to 1, and then also we looked at a lot of definitions around adult care and senior housing and group housing, and recognizing that we weren't in line with the state on a lot of the way that we were describing those things. So we set definitions, and that came from you all as well, and that was really heavy lift. It was super complicated, so I really do appreciate everyone's participation.
I'm sorry to interrupt, Laura.
Yes, sir.
We're having a lot of trouble hearing you on your microphone.
Really? Okay.
Oh, maybe that's why he brought us the,
Can you hear me now?
No.
No.
he did bring a handheld mic, so
Gosh.
maybe.
Hello, can you hear me now?
Absolutely.
Oh, fabulous. This is not a feeling I'm accustomed to. Okay, I'm not sure what to do. Okay, I try not to get all thrown off. I feel like I should bust into a song or something. Right, exactly. Okay. Development review. We had 6 variance requests, 3 modifications to community service uses, 1 conditional use, a subdivision replat, and a natural resource review. We had our annual joint meeting with the PC and the NDAs. We do that every year as well. And out of that came 2 things. Staff developed a new training module called So You Received a Land Use Notification, Now What? So hoping to train people on what they're supposed to do and how we can be more helpful walking them through that process. And the other thing that we're doing as a companion piece to that is also developing a piece of paper, like an overview of what to do when you get a land use notification, and actually stick it in the land use notification mailing so that it becomes something that they can look at and read right then, because sometimes it's hard when you see a presentation to translate that into something that's happening right in the minute. So we're working on that now. And then there was also the request to kind of be able to share out more information on a regular basis. So Joseph had brought back the community development overview to you all once a month, and so now we're just sending that to the NDAs, and they seem super appreciative of that. So I think that was a really great idea. Then what have we got? 2023, 2024. Hopefully we'll have some middle housing applications to review. Remember, a lot of those, they can just come in straight for building permits. They don't have to go through a land use review process unless they have something that they want to get a variance for, or they need to do a land division kind of thing. So most of them will be going straight to building permit review. We know we have an application. There's actually a 13-unit development coming in down off Lava Drive that is actually has to go through a Type 3 review because it's within the Willamette Greenway, not because of what is actually being built. So that is coming through. And then we have the parks, obviously, that Adam Moore's been working on a lot with the community. So those are things that we know are coming the rest of the year. And then also looking at, and that's the development review part of it. And then we've really been doing a lot of kind of the comprehensive plan implementation work. So we've got the neighborhood hubs coming up. We've actually been deep into that already. And what we'll be doing with the Planning Commission is we've done public outreach, and we're getting ready to have some workshops throughout the community in early October. And so then we'll do the code revisions and test the code revisions, and then we'll be bringing them back through the Planning Commission. We think that there may be some opportunities for some more work there, which I will talk about in a minute. Finally, we're kicking off the transportation system plan. I think that finally, I think that we're going to be able to have our first transportation plan advisory committee meeting in October. That's what we are shooting for. So the idea is that we will have our first meeting, a kickoff, and then, so that's about September. So hopefully we can get through the whole process by the end of 2024 or somewhere into early 2025. We're working on the schedule. We just kicked it off officially with the consultant, so that was great. I think there's a really good team there. I'm really excited about getting out and finally being able to talk to folks about what we're going to be doing. And then the next thing that's slated that we haven't talked about yet, and we're actually on your agenda to come back and talk to you kind of about what this work will entail, is next up on the work plan was the Natural Resources Code overview update. And so we have been really digging into what it is that we need to be doing for that work as part of the comprehensive plan. And then also as part of some issues that we have within our own code that we've come up quite frequently that we know we need to fix. So we will be back to you in September, and then these folks will go through that with us once we kind of get the scope of work figured out, and then we'll be coming back and going through some code changes, and that'll be into probably 2024. And then the other things that we have to keep coming back, so we put the climate-friendly, equitable communities work on hold, the removing of the parking mandates, and then a bunch of other stuff, because DLCD is in the rulemaking process now, and they're making some minor tweaks to some language in that. So we put it on pause so that we could just come knowing exactly what they were going to come out with before we went into another discussion about it. So we're hoping that that is going to be happening sometime towards the end of the year, and then we'll come back with code amendments. The other part of that is the bicycle parking. We pulled that out knowing that when we removed all the parking mandates from our code, our bicycle parking requirements were tied to the number of parking spaces we required. So in not having that, we decided we kind of needed to reassess the bicycle parking. So we've been working on that, and we just had a workshop with the Planning Commission. Then we found out that the DLCD and the rulemaking process might actually change some of that bicycle parking requirements as well, because there's a big conversation going around the region and going around city, around the country. It's like, do bicycle parking requirements have a high cost to them, and having a conversation about what is the right balance of how much to provide versus trying to get more units. So anyway, we'll come back. That's to come. We'll wait and see what the rulemaking says. Actually, we'll probably go back to Planning Commission and talk about a few things about that before it makes its way to you all more in 2024. So that's taken up a little bit of time. Also, as you're well aware, we've been going through our housekeeping and bringing some code packages to Planning Commission and to you all. And then another thing that's going to be coming is our land division code, which is Title 17. What we realized through kind of the parking and the trees conversation, we had been talking about looking at land division at the time of land division and how we could potentially save important trees during the land division process. And we realized our code isn't quite doing that. So we wanted to have a bigger conversation with ourselves to see how it might be possible to do that and then walk through that with you all. And at the same time, we realized that we also have a lot of extraneous code in our land division code. We've talked to the county, we've talked to a lot of folks, and it turns out we can streamline our Title 17 quite a bit and make it easier both for community members and us to process. So that is coming. We're working on that. That'll go to the Planning Commission in early fall. And then beyond 2024, we have this long list of things that we've known is floating around out there coming in the future. So we've got this list of discuss the parks and institution zoning. We don't have one now, talking about maybe doing that or looking at the zoning that we have and maybe better accommodating the parks and institutions in the city. Looking at the Willamette Greenway zone. There was very specific information in the comprehensive plan. It's one of the most detailed chapters with specifics on what we're supposed to be doing for the Willamette Greenway. So that's on the list. Looking at revising or consolidating our downtown plans and to potentially updating them and creating one plan. Looking at our historic resources inventory. Looking at expanding floodplain protection, which a note about that. I think you read in the staff report that initially looking at the floodplain protection was scheduled to go alongside the natural resources work. But because of what is going on with the state and with FEMA, and we're going to be getting new regulations coming down from FEMA, potentially, or coming down from the lawsuit that was filed against Oregon and the National Insurance, you know what I'm talking about, Mayor Beatty. I always get the words in the wrong order. Look in the flood program. So we were thinking that instead of going through that conversation now, that it would be smart for us to wait and just have the conversation all at once. So, but we can talk more about that when we kind of like talk about the overall work plan, which we also have scheduled, just so you all know, in a later time for the city council to talk about planning's long-term work plan. So that we have scheduled for September. So tonight we're kind of like looking more at the short-term schedule, but this is just thinking about what's coming. Then we also added a bunch of work from the housing production strategy implementation, right? Because we have a requirement to do some of that work that we talked about. And these 3 things are the things that we put out through 2027, I believe. So we need to put that on the work plan. And then we also, I said unknown. Sometimes maybe I'd want to unknown, but unknown state required code updates that I don't know that are coming that I bet there are. So that's kind of what we've got coming down the road. And with that, I just wanted to open up to questions, discussions from the Planning Commission, from the City Council.
So let me say, City Council, usually, we've been trying for the last couple of months a more structured thing of questions, like in an order and stuff, but I don't think we want to do that tonight. I think we want to have more of a give and take. So we have these are the equivalent of, are you guys using them? No? These are the equivalent of, when you turn your name tag on, when you want to talk, you put them up here. And the folks online can raise their hands, their virtual hands or their physical hands, I guess. Did you want to start out, Jacob?
Sure, yeah. Thanks, Mayor Beatty and City Councilors. Nice to see you all. I think maybe just in starting, I think a question that I have for you all is, I think in thinking about your council adopted goals, is thinking about those priorities as they relate to the Planning Commission. And so, thinking about climate change and resilience, thinking about diversity, equity, inclusion, and then thinking about parks, I feel like I see the clearest line of sight to the work that we're doing kind of probably in that first goal, as we're thinking about climate change and resilience, things like the transportation system plan update, things like middle housing. But I wanted to just kind of maybe
hear a little bit from you all about that, from your perspective on our work. And then I think wanted to maybe just open the floor to other commissioners, questions they might have for you all. And I think wanted to talk a little bit specifically about Neighborhood Hubs project and some questions and that I have for you all. So maybe that is just kind of framing things out, and would love to open the floor and hear some of your thoughts on kind of direction from goals.
Does anyone want to talk about goals? I mean, I think you're right. The most obvious connection is the climate goal, and that gets into the floodplains and a lot of things on the lists that Laura just showed us. There may be something coming out of, we're having an equity, there's a report of an equity assessment we're going to get next month.
Correct.
Yeah.
And that'll have work plan items that we can discuss at that time.
Yeah. So I guess we'll know then, sort of, if there's a connection with that goal or not for Planning Commission. Parks, obviously you're seeing the parks plans, but yeah, the bigger question about, the future of parks in Milwaukie is at this point not something I see that has a real Planning Commission nexus, but, it could at some point. Other thoughts from other counselors?
Just from previously being on Planning Commission, I know Chair Sherman was a big proponent before on a lot of the climate stuff, and when it came to variances, and I too see that as a big part of it, right? Because now we have the EV infrastructure, and we're probably going to push for, well, we did vote last year to push for more than what the state requirement is. So that's where I see the tying, and I just have to say, obviously my big thing has been housing. I mean, that ties into it as well. I look at diversity and inclusion thing as well. So that ties in with that goal, and the work that you guys done in terms of, making it a little bit easier for people to be able to build the housing we need.
Really more back and process maybe outside of the existing scope. I think one thing that I wanted to that I raised with staff, I think tonight with council, is an interest in seeing if whether or not we can include King Road in the current scope of our neighborhood hubs conversation. I think at Planning Commission over the last year, as we've talked about middle housing and increasing density, continued conversation around the zoning map as it relates to the city, but seeing, I think, opportunity along King Road, where we already have designated hub at 42nd and King. We're also talking about potential hub at Linwood, and the 20 connection between those areas, I think, is something there's some interest, I think, from some members of the commission in trying to include in the current of the project. I think understanding kind of staff financial constraints for wanting something like that, and missing opportunity a lot of things on the agenda, and knowing that, housing units that are built today or next year, and then housing units that are built 5 years from now or 10 years from now. Also, I think another component of that is knowing that the city, kind of through the public works side and engineering side of the business, is looking at safe improvements between 42nd and Linwood. I think an opportunity to think holistically about those improvements and how those improvements may or may not support increased development. I would hope we could think about that now rather than make improvements now or next year and then wish we'd made maybe improvements in the future as we think about some of those large parcels. So that, I think, was one of the specific things that I wanted to kind of open a conversation up. Not sure if other members of the commission have anything they want to say on that.
Well, Councilor Stavenjord, card up.
I used the goose. I'm really excited about the neighborhood hubs conversation. And I think that well, actually, I think a lot of what the Planning Commission does is tied to our equity and inclusion goal, because really helping to shape the built environment of the city. So creating that foundation and laying that foundation appropriately is critical to keeping our communities welcoming and really, retaining everyone. That as we change in Milwaukie, that we're not forcing folks out. King Road, I think, absolutely. Not only because of the two located parallel work with the neighborhood Llewellyn that has been looking at some of the crossings and the safety issues. I think that arterial is ripe for transit improvements, and I think that as we're looking at opportunities for zoning changes, perhaps around the hubs, there could be another opportunity to lay that foundation so that we're building our infrastructure for the future of the city. So I just really want to appreciate the forward thinking of the Planning Commission and say how excited I am connected to that conversation about the hubs. So thank you.
Did you want to? We have a Commissioner Edge.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you, Chair Thurman. I think that this is an important subject, and it actually connects with several of the other projects that we have coming up. And I want to echo what I've already heard about King Road, so I don't need to really repeat, all of that. I think it would be a great candidate for what we're calling in the region better bus improvements. It already has the frequent transit connection between the regional center and the town center, and it seems like that's a great corridor to enable further investment. And so I would like to see those neighborhood hubs, as well as in the transportation system planning work, really kind of focus on King Road and what King Road can do for the city. And another part of this is where it connects with the high density residential zones work, making those more productive, or increasing the capacity, which is one of the housing production strategies priorities that we identified. There's high density residential zone land around King Road, and and so we really want to think about what that land should be doing in that context, particularly as it could support neighborhood hubs, economic development, and support transit improvements. Another thing to think about is that some of the high density residential zone land near King Road are only 2 mobile home parks, and that those are important assets to the city in terms of preserving what's called naturally occurring affordable housing. And so we really need to think about what, as we're visiting what our HDR zones are, should be doing and looking at making those, more investment ready and more productive, we need to think about how that impacts some of the other land that's zoned in HDR that might be under redevelopment pressure. So all of this kind of, I think King Road is kind of a hotspot, in this sense that we really want to focus on that corridor, very purposefully and deliberately, and that there's a lot of connected, but kind of still independently moving opportunities where this is going to come up. And so I think that, as just again, to echo what Chair Sherman said, including King Road in nearer term planning work is probably advantageous for us.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor Beatty. I don't want to restate what the other two commissioners have already stated, but I would just also want to echo that I'm on the same mind that it's an opportunity to, to work in King Road into their current phase. And I would pretty much echo pretty much what Chair Edge and Chair Sherman said. Thank you.
New. I think it's mentioned service 3 going to invest into but it is been a John TriMet that we actually asked to represent us among but they that I would say have these have a hell of a street hubs. I will say on the and of course our staff is over reasons the hub conversation was pulled out of the comp plan and sort of set aside for a later day. I mean, I think there were a number of reasons, and part of it was just the overall, size of the comp plan work. But one of the reasons was there was a little tension or a little lack of, I don't know, it's been a worry of mine, I guess, since that time, is that we were talking about 8, 9, 10 potential hub locations, but the financial and the people who are the sort of financial experts were saying only 3 or 4 of these are really going to be financially viable as to attract the kind of development that people are thinking about when they're thinking about hubs. And so I've been worried that we not create over expectation in all the neighborhoods of a lot of hubs, and that maybe we should be thinking a smaller number of hubs that are more concentrated. So that's an interesting background to this idea about King Road. Because I do think, every NDA or every sort of area wants their place to be a hub, but there's, do we create expectations about funding roles that the city doesn't have the funding to do and perform? Do we create sort of creating expectations that all these places are gonna magically transmogrify, whatever, into, these not realistic, and maybe we had, so that is a concern I have had.
I was just going to say, Mayor Beatty, if I may, I think that's a conversation we've had at Planning Commission as well, is recognizing, the city is not, the driving development factor in creation of hubs. And it's really the market. And I think one thing that I've talked about with fellow commissioners is, and with staff, and I appreciate staff, I think has heard this point, is that as we're talking about development of hubs, we also need to think competitively about how Milwaukie is situated to our neighbors to the north, whether that be in Selwood, in Woodstock, or even in Brentwood, Darlington, where the city of Portland is actually getting ready to significantly upzone some commercial corridors there. And so, we can have those dreams and those aspirations for what we see in our community. And if, the development, what we offer from a development perspective differs significantly or is less competitive than what's being offered blocks, mere blocks away, where the built environment maybe already has more amenities than our hubs do. We're just going to continue to not see that development. And so I think, I look forward to more conversations about that, but completely agree with your point about being careful about community expectations. It's not a chicken in every pot kind of conversation with the community there.
And if I could just add, yes, we've been having those conversations so much internally as well as we've been digging into the Hubs project, and we've really started to recategorize them, thinking about them a little bit differently and how we can treat them differently, and understanding that not all of them. I think the original idea for hubs was there would be some sort of transition, that you would have a small hub and it would grow over time and people would invest in them. But I think that we need to be thinking about them a little bit differently, and that's kind of part of the work that we're going through now and that we'll bring back to you all. Sometimes it's just a corner market in the neighborhood, that you want it to be a corner market in the neighborhood. It doesn't necessarily need to be anything other than that, right? Like, that is a hub and it functions that role. So I do think that your point about we're looking at the transportation system and how you connect the hubs, which there will be less hubs that we prioritize, most definitely. We've kind of taken a bunch of factors and tried to sift them out differently, something that's a little bit more implementable and realistic. But also connecting those different hubs. The transportation system plan has the hubs in the transportation system plan, so that we're being really careful about how we're connecting each of those hubs. So that'll be part of the conversation. I think that what we're coming to realize is that we have a scope of work now that we're actually more than halfway through with our consultant. So we don't have it in this scope of work to include that analysis. However, we are realizing that there may be some projects coming out that we do need to talk about, that we talk about as phase 3 of hubs. And this might be part of that conversation. And so we will keep that in mind, knowing that that's an important conversation. We've also been thinking about maybe there's little areas that while things may not develop at the rate that we want them to, maybe we need to start thinking about doing some little small area plans. That's something that's coming out of thinking about hubs. Maybe there's an opportunity to do a little corridor plan. Obviously, that's coming out of hubs. So we are thinking all of these things that you're saying. We're actually thinking about the future, because the hubs, as they were kind of envisioned, are one thing, but maybe we need to be envisioning something a little bit above and beyond the hubs, and how can the city play a little bit different role in the hubs conversation. So we're kind of like halfway through that. So I will bring all of that good conversation back to you all and see kind of like what your thoughts are and where we're landing.
Great.
Yeah.
Can I just add one thing real fast? Just so that you all know we're hearing you. Joseph and I are also having conversations about how we invest using the CET funds that are economic development related, and the URA dollars. The URA portion of that, we'll be holding our first MMC team meeting in the near future. We've hired a consultant to help us develop those programs and to get those rolled out. We're going to try and pair the programs for CET and the programs for URA together so that you're not confused based on your address as to which programs you can use. They're just funded through different sources. I'm looking at Joe, but I don't think we have any concern, even if it's not in round 2 of hubs, using those funds to try and develop King Road in a way that really lifts that whole corridor. So I just wanted to make sure council and others don't believe that we can't, this isn't a linear process. This is a moving forward Milwaukie process, and so we will be bringing that sometime this fall.
Great.
Thanks.
Councilor Massey?
Thank you. Gosh, listening to Laura go through what they did last year and what's ahead, I think that she was actually panting. And and I don't blame her. I'm glad I'm not working for Laura, and I think I got off the planning commission in the nick of time.
Ouch.
You all did a very heavy lift yourselves, just so you know. I mean, a lot has been going on for the last couple of years, and you were part of that.
So I mentioned in one of the updates from Laura about the inquiries and the permits that have been generated for middle housing, that I kind of went from a degree of skepticism a couple of years ago that we were going to see this middle housing come to a degree of optimism. And, you know, we don't see all those. You don't even see them because we've changed the code, and so some of them are just permits and that kind of thing. But you know, do you have this same level of optimism, or am I just in a cloud somewhere about middle housing?
I still am optimistic. I think, like we always we thought it was going to be a slow transition. And I think that's the phase that we're in. I think there was a lot of excitement at the very beginning. We had a lot of pre-app conversations with folks about middle housing opportunities. We haven't seen many of them come to fruition. We've got a couple in the queue now. We've got a couple of cottage clusters that, while they don't have building permits, but they are looking at doing transportation impact studies with the engineering department. We have a couple of duplexes that are getting permitted. We do have one cottage cluster, a 6-unit cottage cluster that's actually in permits now. We've only had actually 4 middle housing projects go through permitting so far. We've talked a lot, but we don't have them all the way through. I think that there's a learning curve that's going on because folks aren't used to developing this type of housing, and so they're crunching numbers and spending a lot of time drawing on paper and trying to figure out what's going to work, and nobody's come up with the formula yet. So it may take a little time for that formula to kind of start to work. So I'm still optimistic, but I think it's going to be kind of a slow process.
Could I ask the same question of Jacob? What do you think?
That's a great question, Councilor Massey. I think that similarly, you know, see the monthly report that comes out about the inquiries and the permits and those kinds of things. And so I would agree that I think folks are probably trying to understand how it pencils out from a pro forma perspective and how you fit the units on the site. So I know there's a parcel not too far from my house that's on my walking route that continues to have its, you know, big sign up about the 6 or 8 units that are going in there. And, you know, I guess I'll believe it when I see it. But I think there's intentions there. So, you know, I think it's important for us to step back, and it's probably a little bit challenging, even for myself, admittedly, recognizing, you know, the composition of the urban environment's something that these are choices we made over 80 years or 100 years that got us to where we are today. Are we going to see a tidal wave change in 1 year, 5 years, 10 years? Probably not. But I still think it's probably some of the right moves. And of course, we're also encouraged by our friends at the state.
Well, and you said there's a 13-unit something on Lava Drive, right?
Yeah, but it's multifamily.
It is. I thought it was
Or townhomes, I'm not sure which it's gonna
townhomes.
be.
Well, townhomes is
Not
middle
townhomes,
housing.
sorry. I mean, it's either, it's apartments. I don't know if they're condos or
Okay.
apartments.
Okay.
Yeah, it's just a 13.
Okay.
And Mayor Beatty, and I see Commissioner Edge has his hand up. I think one thing that, and this is out of the middle housing conversation, but Councilor Edge mentioned earlier the housing capacity analysis, the housing production strategy. One thing that we had a conversation of at council, and I'll hand this over to Commissioner Edge in a second, is I think noticed in a very stark way the underproduction of housing units in the high density residential zone. And one thing that I might posit, or have at least floated amongst the council and with staff, is that the high density residential zone still allows single dwelling units as a permitted use. And if we're making a choice to call some of these parcels high-density residential, perhaps that's not a choice we want to continue to make moving forward. And instead, we need to kind of demand more from those parcels by not allowing single dwellings moving forward. So, I think that would be a broader conversation we'd want to have. It, again, is pretty technical or in the weeds, but just thinking about, the aspiration we've set for those parcels, and then the development community sometimes bringing, what's easy or what's known. Those might be some things we want to think more about.
Councilor Kosherbody's had his thing up for a while, so I want to give him.
Just real quick, and I don't know, Commissioner Edge might actually bring this up as well. But going back to the HCTC, the Housing Capacity Technical Committee, I think once we see, I'm optimistic about the middle housing, because I think once we see those recommendations become more implemented, it's going to bring about more of that production, because there was a list of things on there, a number of things that can be done to incentivize and bring about more of that middle housing that's missing. So once those things start getting implemented more, I think we'll also, I'm optimistic that we'll see more of it come to Milwaukie. And actually, you bring up a very good point, Chair Sherman, about the having single families, single residents in a high density zone. That's a very interesting point that you make. I appreciate you bringing that up.
Okay, Commissioner Edge?
Thank you. I wanted to respond to Councilor Matthews' question of Laura and Chair Sherman. We've had middle housing legalized for over a year, for about 13 months. We've had 4 permits. We've turned no dirt. This is exactly what we expected. There's no need to be, there's not really any sign at this point of being optimistic or pessimistic. This is exactly what was expected. Nothing in the first year. We have further to go because we're not getting enough interest. We haven't had a pre-application conference around middle housing in over 2 months. I think that it's great that we're hearing about townhouses being developed on Lava Drive. There's townhouses at St. 52nd and Jackson that are proposed. So there's things that are being proposed into the pipeline, but nothing has turned any dirt yet. So, we still need to be looking, I think pretty aggressively at what do we do to spur small scale investment on, for, small lot landowners. Because, we really want to, make it possible for anybody to, see their land as an investment and then use, leverage that investment to further the goals and the policies of the city. And so, we've got some more work to do there. I think that we can really leverage the high-density residential zones work for that purpose. And we'll probably learn some things there that we might be able to apply to the moderate density zones. I think that, we do want to go into that work. We want to be very, very open with what we consider as far as, allowed uses, lot sizes, form factor, density, all of that. So, anyway, I think that's important work yet to come. I think we need to prioritize that relatively soon so that we can adopt some amendments and, start to, because again, we need to be on these 3 to 6 year update cycles to, honor the spirit of the housing production strategies work. And so, that means that we kind of don't stop moving in terms of our housing work. We need to keep prioritizing it until we start to see results. And we're not seeing results yet. And as optimistic as people might feel, we're not seeing results. And so I see no cause for optimism at this point. I had another couple comments about things that had also come up. If we wanted to turn away from housing, I don't want to, I mean, if someone else wants to have the opportunity to kind of speak, that's fine. But
Well, we're about at our limit. We're about at our end point, so go ahead and throw out there what you wanted to throw out there. But yeah, we're at our...
Okay, great. So earlier we were talking about, I was listening in while you were talking about FEMA and the natural hazards mitigation plan for, these repeat loss infant potential properties, and that they hadn't actually been buying into the insurance program. And so one of the things that we can do, obviously, I think it's great that I really want to get on top of our floodplains regulations, but I think it's good that we're waiting because there will be likely some changes coming through that FEMA process and, through Metro and then to us. And so, but what we can do also is, in the meantime, we can look at the community rating system. And the FEMA's National Flood Insurance Program community rating system is an optional program that FEMA jurisdictions can participate in that will, depending on how you score, different things that you do to make your floodplain development, better for the environment and safer for property owners. You basically get a score, and from that score, it deducts a percentage of the premiums that the NFIP participants pay, every month or every year, and so that might be a way to increase the participation in the National Flood Insurance Program in the city, is to participate in the community rating systems and to actually be able to drop that premium down to a lower price point for qualifying property owners. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Other things you want to say in closing, either?
Maybe just in closing, I would love to create an opportunity for any of my commissioners who haven't said anything to share anything if they would like.
So, Mr. Carpenter, Commissioner Carpenter, you have anything you want to add?
Happy to be here.
Okay. Well, thanks for coming. And Commissioner Mulhern, new guy on the block.
Yeah.
Anything you'd like to say?
Nothing substantive, but excited to be here and looking forward to working with you all.
Great. Well, thanks for coming. Thanks for logging in, all three of you guys on the Zoom. Any last things from counselors? All right.
Great, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. You've got a busy year. Yeah. And with that, we are adjourned, and council will begin the regular session at 6 o'clock. Thank you.
Sorry, we're going to have a
Regular session.
But I hear you.